My name is Sophie Halverson, and the day my brother called me begging for my signature was the same day I finally understood that every sacrifice I ever made had been building toward that exact moment. He needed me. Not my parents, not his golf buddies, not the network of people my father had spent decades curating like a prized collection. Me. The daughter they wrote off. The sister they buried. The woman they told to go find a husband instead of a future. And the most beautiful, devastating part of it all? I had every right to say no. But let me back up because this story doesn't start with a phone call. It starts in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, in a house with a two-car garage and a family that had very clear ideas about who mattered and who didn't. Before I get into all of it, if this kind of story speaks to you, if you've ever been the one in your family who was overlooked, underestimated, or just flat out erased, please take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I'm going to need you with me for every part of this because it only gets more intense from here. Now let's go back to the beginning. Cherry Hill, New Jersey, is one of those towns that looks like it has everything figured out. Wide streets, good school districts, the kind of neighborhoods where every house has a freshly sealed driveway and a basketball hoop in the yard that nobody actually uses anymore. It's comfortable, quietly competitive, the kind of place where people measure their success in property values and country club memberships and the colleges their kids get into. I grew up on Alderbrook Court, a cul-de-sac off a main road lined with oak trees that turned gold every October. From the outside, our house looked like the rest of them. Brick front, black shutters, a wreath on the door that my mother switched out with the seasons. From the inside, it was a different world entirely. My father, Dennis Halverson, was a commercial real estate developer. He built strip malls and office parks across South Jersey for 30 years, and he was proud of it in that particular way that men of his generation carry pride, loudly, constantly, and always in connection to money. He drove a silver BMW that he replaced every 3 years. He wore a Tag Heuer watch he'd bought himself when he closed his first $1 million deal, and he referenced that watch in conversation more than any human being ever should. My mother, Carol, was a part-time bookkeeper for a local dental practice. Soft, accommodating, the kind of woman who refilled your glass before you even knew it was empty. She kept the peace in our house the way a groundskeeper maintains a golf course, constantly, quietly, and without anyone ever noticing the work. Then there was Marcus. My brother, Marcus Halverson, was 2 years younger than me and the gravitational center of our entire family. He played lacrosse. He had my father's jaw and my mother's easy smile and the kind of confidence that gets handed to boys at birth in families like ours. He wasn't a bad person when we were kids, I want to be fair about that. He was just the one who was chosen. And when you grow up being chosen, you don't question it. You just keep walking through the doors that keep opening for you, and you never look back to see who got left on the other side. I was the one on the other side. I was always a better student than Marcus. Not by a little, by a lot. I won the district science competition 3 years in a row. I was on the debate team, the honor roll, the National Junior Honor Society. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Petrakis, pulled me aside in 10th grade and told me I had what it took to go anywhere I wanted after high school. I remember walking home that day feeling electric, like the future was this wide open thing just waiting for me to step into it. I walked through the front door and my father was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing blueprints, and I told him what she said. He looked up from the blueprints, considered me for exactly 2 seconds and said, "That's nice, sophomore. What's for dinner?" That was the pattern. My achievements were pleasant background noise. Marcus's were events. When Marcus made varsity lacrosse as a sophomore, my father took the whole family to dinner at the nicest steakhouse in Cherry Hill. When I was accepted into the National Merit Scholar Program, my mother made me a congratulations card from the dollar store and my father nodded from behind his newspaper. I stopped telling them things after a while. I learned to keep my victories quiet, to celebrate alone in my room with the door closed, to find my worth in the work itself rather than in their reaction to it. The moment everything crystallized, the moment I understood with absolute clarity what I was dealing with, came the summer before I started college. I was 17, nearly 18, and I had just received my acceptance letter from Rutgers University with a partial academic scholarship. It was a good package, genuinely impressive, but I still needed supplemental funding to cover the gap. About $12,000 a year. I had done the math obsessively. I knew exactly what I needed and I worked up the nerve to ask for it over dinner one Sunday, which in our house was the designated time for important conversations. I laid out the letter, the scholarship breakdown, the tuition figures. I had written notes on a piece of paper so I wouldn't stumble. I explained the gap clearly, calmly, the way Mrs. Petrakis taught us to present arguments in debate. I even offered to pay them back once I was working. My father cut a piece of his pot roast, chewed it slowly, and then looked at me with an expression I will never forget for as long as I live. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even cold. It was just indifferent, the way you look at something that simply doesn't factor into your plans. Sophie, he said, setting down his fork. That money is already spoken for. Marcus is going to need it for school. Marcus was 15. He hadn't applied anywhere. He hadn't even taken the SATs yet. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her plate. I looked at Marcus. He was looking at his phone under the table, pretending he couldn't hear any of it. The silence in that kitchen was suffocating. I waited for someone to say something, to push back, to at least acknowledge the absurdity of what had just been said. Nobody did. My father picked his fork back up. Honestly, honey, you don't need to overthink this. You're a pretty girl. You're personable. Find yourself a good man, get settled, and let him worry about the finances. That's the smarter play for someone like you. Someone like you. I have turned those 3 words over in my mind 10,000 times since that evening. Someone like you. As though being female was a category that came with a ceiling already installed. As though everything I had worked for, every grade, every award, every late night with a textbook, had simply been a pleasant hobby rather than a foundation for a real life. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, at least not in front of them. I folded my acceptance letter back into the envelope, pushed my chair back from the table and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet of my room and I made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. I was going to figure it out myself. Every single dollar of it. And I was never going to ask Dennis Halverson for a single thing ever again. I kept that promise. Rutgers accepted me and I showed up with a patchwork of funding I had assembled entirely on my own. A partial academic scholarship. A federal Pell Grant. 2 private scholarships I had applied for without telling my parents. One from a local women's professional association and one from a real estate industry foundation, which felt like a particular irony given my father's career. I took out the minimum in student loans I could manage and I got a job waitressing at a chain restaurant off Route 73 nights a week and all day Saturday. My uniform was a red polo shirt that smelled permanently of fryer oil no matter how many times I washed it. I wore it like armor. Meanwhile, my father sat Marcus down that same fall and told him the plan. Full tuition covered. Room and board covered. A monthly allowance so he wouldn't have to work during the school year and could, as my father put it, focus on becoming something. Marcus enrolled at Penn State 2 years later. Business administration. My father drove him to campus in the BMW, helped him set up his dorm room, and took him out for a celebratory dinner before driving home. I know this because my mother texted me photos. I was in the middle of a double shift when they came through. I looked at them on my phone in the break room between tables, then put my phone back in my apron pocket and went back to work. I graduated from Rutgers in 4 years with a degree in finance and a 3.91 GPA. I walked across that stage and nobody from my family was there. My father had a client meeting. My mother said she wasn't feeling well. I wore my cap and gown and shook the dean's hand and took my own photo in the parking lot afterward, my diploma held up against the afternoon sky. Then I drove back to my apartment and applied for 3 jobs before midnight. What I built over the next 8 years I built quietly, deliberately and entirely without them. But the story of how it all came back around, how Marcus's choices and my father's games eventually collided with the life I had constructed brick by brick, that part was still coming. And I had no idea just how much they were going to need me before it was over. 8 years is a long time to build something in silence. But that's exactly what I did. I didn't go into finance because it was glamorous. I went into it because numbers made sense to me in a way that people sometimes didn't, and because I had spent enough of my life watching my father make money decisions that favored comfort over fairness. I wanted to understand the machinery behind wealth. Not inherit it, not marry into it, understand it, control it, build it with my own 2 hands. And that's precisely what happened. My first job out of Rutgers was an analyst position at a mid-sized investment firm in Philadelphia called Donnelly Capital Group. The commute from my studio apartment in Collingswood was 40 minutes each way on the Patco train, and I made that commute every single day for 3 years without complaint. The work was relentless. 70-hour weeks were normal. I was often the youngest person in the room and almost always the only woman, and I learned quickly that in environments like that, you don't get the benefit of the doubt. You earn it over and over again every single day until people stop being surprised by your competence and start depending on it instead. I was promoted twice in 3 years. By 26, I was a senior analyst. By 28, I was managing a small portfolio of commercial real estate investment accounts, which felt like the universe had a very specific sense of humor given my father's line of work. By 30, I had been headhunted by a larger firm, Vantage Capital Partners in Center City, Philadelphia, and I took the offer without hesitating. The salary jump alone would have made the 18-year-old version of me, the one in the red polo shirt smelling of fryer oil, burst into tears in the best possible way. I built my life with precision. I bought my own condo in Rittenhouse Square at 29. I drove a car I paid for in cash. I had a financial advisor, an accountant, a carefully structured investment portfolio, and a savings account that would have made my father's jaw drop if he ever knew the number in it. Which he didn't because I didn't tell him. I didn't tell my family much of anything during those years. My mother and I spoke occasionally, surface-level conversations about weather and health and whether I was eating enough. My father and I spoke almost never. Marcus and I were polite strangers at best, the kind of siblings who liked each other's posts on social media without actually knowing anything real about each other's lives. That distance was intentional on my part, and I am not ashamed of it. I had built something fragile and important in those years, and I was not willing to let the particular brand of carelessness my family specialized in anywhere near it. Marcus, meanwhile, had taken a different road. After Penn State, he'd gone to work for my father's development company, Halverson Property Group, as a project manager. My father had handed it to him like a gift wrapped in inevitability. Marcus had the title, the office, the company card, and the surname on the building. What he didn't have, and what became clearer with every passing year, was any real understanding of how to run a business. My father had always handled the financial architecture of Halverson Property Group personally, with a small team of accountants he had worked with for decades. Marcus was the face, the handshake, the charm. My father was the engine. The problem with that arrangement was that it created a son who believed he was more capable than he actually was. And it created a father who believed his son could do no wrong right up until the moment everything started going sideways. I found out about the problems at Halverson Property Group the way I found out about most things in my family, obliquely through my mother, in a phone call that started with small talk and ended with something that made me sit very still at my kitchen island for a long time afterward. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. I had just gotten home from a 12-hour day and I was eating leftover Thai food straight from the container when my mother called. She started with the usual. "How are you eating? Is it cold there yet? Did I see that Carol Burnett documentary?" And then, after a pause that had weight to it, she said, "Your father's been stressed, Sophie. More than usual. It's the business." I put down my fork. "What about the business?" Another pause. "Marcus got involved in some deals. Big ones. Your father trusted him to manage the financing side on 2 new development projects in Camden, and your father didn't review the contracts carefully enough before they signed. There were some clauses. Penalty clauses. And the projects hit delays because of the permitting situation with the county, and now." She trailed off. "How bad?" I asked. "Bad enough that your father had to bring in an outside advisor last month. Someone from his bank. They've been meeting a lot." I absorbed that. I knew exactly what that meant in real estate development terms. When your bank sends someone to sit in on your internal meetings, they are not there to offer encouragement. They are there because they want to understand their exposure before deciding what to do about it. That is not a social call. That is the beginning of a very specific and very uncomfortable process. I didn't say any of that to my mother. I just said I was sorry to hear it and that I hoped things would work out, and I got off the phone as quickly as I politely could. Then I sat in my kitchen with the Thai food going cold in front of me, and I thought about what I had just heard. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think honesty is the whole point of telling this story. Part of me felt something I am not proud of. A small, sharp, private satisfaction. Not because my family was hurting, I didn't want that, but because the structure that had always propped Marcus up while pushing me down was showing its cracks. The preferential treatment, the handed opportunities, the unearned confidence. All of it had been built on a foundation that was apparently less solid than my father believed. And there was something in me, the 18-year-old who got told to go find a husband while her brother's future was being funded, that registered this information with a grim and quiet recognition. But that feeling passed quickly. Because what came after it was more complicated. 3 weeks after that phone call, Marcus called me directly. Not my mother as an intermediary. Not a text. A real phone call on a Saturday morning, which was already unusual enough to make me answer on the second ring. "Hey," he said. His voice had a texture I hadn't heard before. Something rougher than his usual easy confidence. "You got a few minutes?" "Sure," I said carefully. "What's going on?" There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, working up to something. "Dad's in trouble, sophomore, real trouble. The Camden projects, there are 2 of them, they've hit a wall. The penalty clauses Mom probably mentioned. They're brutal. We're talking about a potential liability of close to $800,000 if we can't restructure the financing before the end of the quarter." I said nothing. I let the silence sit there and do its work. "The bank is willing to work with us," Marcus continued, "but the restructuring requires a personal guarantee from someone with a clean credit profile and verifiable assets outside the business. Dad's personal credit is tied up in the company. Mine is too, because I co-signed on the original project loans." Another pause. "But yours isn't." There was. I set my coffee mug down on the counter very slowly and very deliberately. "Marcus," I said, "are you calling to ask me to co-sign a loan restructuring for Dad's company?" "Not co-sign exactly. It's more like a guarantor signature. It's different." "It's not different," I said. "Not in any way that matters. Sophie, it's the business. It's everything Dad built. If this falls apart, he loses the company. He could lose the house. Mom could lose the house." I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the Rittenhouse Square street below, watching a woman walk a dog in the pale Saturday morning light, and I thought about the dining room table in Cherry Hill. The pot roast. The untouched acceptance letter. The Tag Heuer watch catching the kitchen light as my father delivered his verdict on my future without even putting down his fork. "Let me ask you something," I said, keeping my voice completely level. $800,000. Do you know what my father spent on your education, Marcus? All 4 years, room and board, the allowance." Silence. "I do," I said. "I looked it up once, actually. Penn State out-of-state rates back then, room and board for years. Comes to about $160,000. Give or take." I paused. "You know what he spent on mine?" More silence. "Nothing," I said. "He spent nothing. He told me to find a husband." "Sophie, that's not fair to bring up right now." "Funny," I said. "That's exactly what I thought back then. That it wasn't fair." I picked my coffee mug back up. "I'm not saying no, Marcus. I'm saying I need to think about it. And I need to understand exactly what I'd be signing, every line of it, before anyone puts a document in front of me." "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, that's fair. Send me everything. The restructuring terms, the original loan agreements, the penalty clause documentation, all of it. I'll look at it this week." He said he would. We hung up. I finished my coffee standing at the window, and for a very long time I just watched the street below, thinking about power and the particular way it shifts when the people who once held all of it suddenly find themselves needing something only you can give. The phone call had lasted 11 minutes. But the conversation it started was going to take much longer to finish. The documents Marcus sent arrived in my email inbox at 11:47 on a Sunday night. A zipped folder containing 14 separate files. Loan agreements, amendment proposals, penalty clause breakdowns, a letter from the bank's restructuring division, and a 2-page summary prepared by an outside attorney my father had apparently hired sometime in the last month. I opened my laptop at the kitchen island, poured myself a glass of water, and started reading. I read everything twice. By the time I closed my laptop, it was past 2 in the morning, and I had 3 pages of handwritten notes sitting next to my empty glass. The picture those documents painted was not flattering to anyone involved. Marcus had signed off on both Camden projects with financing terms that were aggressive even in a healthy market. Variable rate construction loans with penalty escalators tied to completion milestones. The kind of structure that works perfectly when everything goes according to schedule and turns catastrophic the moment it doesn't. The permitting delays my mother had mentioned were real and significant, nearly 7 months behind on both sites, and the penalty clauses had been quietly compounding the entire time. What made it worse, and this is the part that made me set my pen down and stare at the ceiling for a full minute, was a single paragraph buried on page 9 of the original loan agreement. A cross-collateralization clause. It meant the 2 projects were financially linked. If one defaulted, both defaulted simultaneously. Marcus had signed this. My father had countersigned it. And based on the timeline in the documents, my father's longtime accountant had retired 8 months before these contracts were executed, meaning the person who might have caught this clause and flagged it was no longer in the room when it mattered most. Marcus hadn't just made a mistake. He had made an expensive, compounding, almost elegant mistake. And my father, who had spent 30 years telling everyone within earshot that he built his business on sharp instincts and sharper attention to detail, had signed right alongside him without apparently reading past the first page. I will tell you what I did not do. I did not call Marcus that night to tell him what I found. I did not call my mother to reassure her. I did not draft a warm email offering my help and my signature and my clean credit history to smooth over a mess I had absolutely no hand in creating. What I did was close my laptop, wash my glass, go to bed and sleep 8 hours. Because I had learned a long time ago that the decisions you make in the early hours of the morning after reading something upsetting are rarely the decisions you'd make in the clear light of the following day. And I needed a clear head for what came next. I called my own attorney Monday morning. Her name is Patricia Weld and she has been my personal attorney since I bought my condo. She is methodical, unhurried, and constitutionally incapable of sugarcoating anything, which is exactly why I trust her. I told her the situation without editorializing. My brother and father ran a real estate development company. They had a financing problem. They needed a guarantor signature from someone outside the business. They had come to me. I sent her the documents while we were still on the phone. She called me back that afternoon. Sophie, she said in the tone she reserves for situations that require measured language, I want to walk you through exactly what you'd be agreeing to if you signed this. She did. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, she paused and said, the exposure here is real. If both projects default, which based on the current trajectory is not an unlikely outcome, the guarantor is on the hook for the full restructured amount. That number, right now, is sitting at $740,000. I let that number sit in the air for a moment. $740,000. I had that, or close to it, between my investment accounts and liquid assets. It would not destroy me. But it would set me back significantly, and it would do so entirely because of choices 2 other people made, neither of whom had ever once made a choice that accounted for me. Patricia, I said, what would you do? She was quiet for a moment. I'd want conditions, she said. If you sign, you don't sign as a passive guarantor. You sign as a named party with enforceable protections. Repayment terms, collateral from your father's personal assets, and a formal written acknowledgement of the debt obligation. Not a handshake. A document. Could that be drafted? I can have something to you by Wednesday, she said. I told her to go ahead. Then I called Marcus. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. Did you look at everything? He asked. I did, I said. I also had my attorney look at it. A beat of silence. Okay. I'm not signing anything as currently structured, Marcus. The exposure is too broad and there are no protections for me if this goes sideways. My attorney is drafting a counter-proposal. If Dad wants my signature, it comes with conditions. The silence stretched longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had shifted. There was something underneath it that I hadn't heard yet, something between embarrassment and resentment. Sophie, this isn't a negotiation. It's family. I almost laughed. That's interesting, I said, coming from the family that told me to go find a husband. You can't keep using that against us every time something comes up. I'm not using it against anyone, I said calmly. I'm using it as context. There is a difference. I paused to let that land. My conditions are reasonable, Marcus. Patricia will send them over. Read them, have your attorney review them, and let's talk again at the end of the week. He hung up without saying goodbye. I set my phone face down on my desk and went back to work. Wednesday came and Patricia sent the draft proposal. The terms were straightforward but firm. My father would put up the Alderbrook Court property as collateral against the guarantee. A formal repayment schedule would be established with monthly installments beginning 90 days after project completion. Both Marcus and my father would sign personal acknowledgements of the debt obligation. And there was one additional clause Patricia had added at my specific request. A formal written statement signed by my father, acknowledging that I had provided material financial support to Halverson Property Group and that this support constituted a debt owed to me personally, not a gift. That last clause was not about money. I want to be clear about that. It was about something else entirely. Something that had been owed to me for a lot longer than any of these contracts had existed. Marcus called me Thursday afternoon. His voice was different again. Quieter. Controlled in the way that people get controlled when they've had to have a conversation they didn't want to have. I talked to Dad, he said. And he's not happy about the collateral clause. The house is Mom's home, Sophie. He feels like you're holding that over them. He put a lien on his business assets to fund your education, I said evenly. He made financial decisions with long-term consequences before. This isn't new territory for him. It's just new territory for me. Another silence. Then quietly, what about the last clause? The written acknowledgement. That one is non-negotiable for me. He won't sign that, Sophie. You know how he is. You're asking him to admit in writing that he made a mistake with you. I'm asking him to acknowledge reality, I said. That's not the same thing as punishing him. It's just the truth. I heard Marcus exhale slowly on the other end of the line. And then something unexpected happened. His voice dropped lower, softer, and he said something I had never heard from him in my entire life. I know it wasn't fair, he said. What they did to you. What I let happen. I was a kid, but I'm not a kid anymore, and I know. He stopped. I'm sorry, sophomore. I mean that. I sat very still at my desk. Outside my window, the Philadelphia skyline was caught in the late afternoon light, all glass and gold. I had waited a long time to hear those words from someone in my family, longer than I could measure. And now that they had arrived, I found that I didn't quite know what to do with them. They didn't fix anything. They didn't erase the dining room table or the pot roast or the scholarship letter folded back into its envelope. But they were real and they were his and they were freely given, and in my family that was rarer than anything I had encountered in a boardroom. I know you mean it, I said finally. That matters to me, Marcus. It genuinely does. So what do we do? Talk to Dad again, I said. Tell him the acknowledgement clause isn't me attacking him. Tell him it's me asking to be seen. That's all it ever was. I paused. If he can do that, I'll sign. Marcus said he would try. We hung up and the line went quiet, and I sat there in the late light of my office thinking about how strange it is when the ground shifts under something you thought was permanently fixed. I had built my entire adult life on the assumption that my father would never acknowledge what he had done. Never see me for what I had become. Never choose me. And yet here I was, one unsigned document away from finding out if I was wrong. The answer came 48 hours later. And it did not arrive the way I expected. I told myself I wasn't going to check my phone every hour waiting for Marcus to report back. I lasted about 4 hours before I gave up on that resolution entirely. But the call didn't come from Marcus. And it didn't come the next morning either. It came on a Saturday, 2 days after our conversation at 9:15, from a number I had saved in my phone under a name I had almost never dialed first. I stared at my father's name on the screen for 3 full rings before I answered. In 32 years, I could count on one hand the number of times Dennis Halverson had called me first. Birthdays occasionally. The time my mother was in the hospital for a minor procedure and he needed someone to pick up a prescription. Once, years ago, when he accidentally dialed me instead of Marcus. That was the complete list. So when his name appeared on my screen that Saturday morning, something in my stomach tightened in a way I hadn't felt since I was 18 years old sitting at that dining room table. I answered, Dad. Sophie. His voice was different. Not weak exactly, but stripped of its usual weight. The boardroom register was gone. What replaced it was something I didn't have a word for right away. It took me a few seconds to identify it. Exhaustion. Real exhaustion, the kind that lives in a person's chest rather than their body. Do you have a few minutes? I do, I said. I moved from my kitchen to the living room and sat down on the couch. I wanted to be still for this conversation. Go ahead. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing, could hear what sounded like him sitting down somewhere, a chair shifting, a door closing. Then he said, Marcus told me about your conditions. All of them. Okay. I want to talk about the last one. Another pause. The acknowledgement. I said nothing. I had learned, over years of sitting across negotiating tables from people who needed something from me, That silence is not emptiness. Silence is pressure. And right now I needed him to feel the weight of the space between us. I've been sitting with it since Thursday, he said. I didn't sleep well. Your mother knows something is going on, but I haven't told her the specifics. He stopped. Started again. I'm not good at this, Sophie. I want you to know that I know that about myself. I know it too, Dad. The clause your attorney drafted. The acknowledgement. He cleared his throat. It says I'm recognizing that you provided material financial support and that it constitutes a debt. He paused. I can sign that part. That's just accurate. That's just facts on paper. I waited. But there's a line in there. His voice tightened slightly and I recognized the tightening. It was what happened when Dennis Halverson was approaching territory he had spent decades carefully avoiding. It says that my prior failure to support your education represented an inequitable distribution of family resources. He said the phrase slowly like he was reading it from a page. Your attorney wrote that. She did, I said. With my input. Silence. Dad, I said quietly, do you disagree with it? The pause that followed was the longest of the entire conversation. Long enough that I checked my screen once to make sure the call was still connected. It was. He was still there. He was just somewhere I had never seen him go before, somewhere inside himself that didn't have a prepared answer waiting. No, he finally said. I don't disagree with it. I closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then sign it, I said. Sign all of it and let's move forward. Sophie. His voice had dropped even lower. I need you to understand something. What I said to you back then about finding a husband, about the degree. I grew up in a house where that was just the way things were. My father did the same thing to my sister. I never questioned it because no one around me ever questioned it. That doesn't make it right. I know that now. But I need you to know it wasn't coming from a place of wanting to hurt you. I sat with that for a moment. It landed differently than I expected. Not as an excuse, he hadn't offered it as one, but as information. Context without defense. And there was something in the plainness of it, the absence of his usual rhetorical armor, that made it land more squarely than any elaborately constructed apology might have. I believe you, I said. That it wasn't intentional cruelty. I've believed that for a while actually. I paused. But Dad, intent and impact are two different things. What you did had consequences that were very real and very long, and I carried them alone. That's what the clause is about. Not blame. Just truth. He was quiet for a long moment. Then roughly, I know. 2 words. But from Dennis Halverson, delivered in that voice on that morning, they carried more weight than a paragraph would have from most people. I'll sign it, he said. All of it. I exhaled slowly. Thank you, Dad. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes after that, talking about nothing in particular, the way people do when they've just said something significant and need the ordinary to resettle around them. He asked about my work. I told him broadly, not in detail. He said the weather in Cherry Hill had been cold. I said Philadelphia too. And then we said goodbye and hung up, and I sat on my couch for a long time afterward, not moving, just thinking. Here's what I thought about. I thought about the version of this moment I had imagined over the years. The confrontation I had played out in my head 100 times. The one where I finally said everything I had never said, and my father finally understood every way he had failed me and broke down and asked for forgiveness, and the weight of it all lifted at once like a physical thing. That moment had always felt like the finish line. The place where the story resolved. But the actual moment was quieter than that. Smaller. Not a confrontation at all, just a tired man on a Saturday morning admitting something true on a phone call. And somehow that was more than the imagined version ever could have been. Because it was real. It was imperfect and incomplete, and it didn't fix anything retroactively. But it was real. I called Patricia on Monday and told her my father had verbally agreed to the terms. She said she would prepare the final documents for signatures and schedule a time for everyone to meet. I told her to make it somewhere neutral, not my father's office, not my parents' house. She suggested a conference room at her firm in downtown Philadelphia. I said that was fine. The meeting was set for the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. I want to tell you about the days leading up to that Thursday because they were not what I expected. I expected to feel triumphant. I had structured a deal on my terms, in my favor, with protections that any reasonable financial advisor would have applauded. I had extracted an acknowledgement from a man who had never voluntarily acknowledged anything that cost him comfort. By any measure I had won. But winning, I was learning, has a texture to it that doesn't always match what you imagined when you were working toward it. Can be flatter, quieter, tinged with something that isn't quite sadness but lives in the same neighborhood. My mother called me Wednesday evening. She had clearly been briefed on the full situation by then, the documents, the conditions, the acknowledgement clause, all of it. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was trying to hold two things at once. Relief that the business might be saved and something more complicated that she couldn't quite name aloud. "Sophie," she said, "I just want you to know that I've been thinking about you. About all of it." She paused. "I know your father and I made choices that weren't fair to you. I made choices. I want to own my part of that." "Mom," I said gently. "I watched you struggle and I told myself you were strong enough to handle it. That you didn't need what we were giving Marcus because you were built differently." Her voice cracked slightly at the edges. "That wasn't strength on my part. That was convenience. I was telling myself a story that let me off the hook." I had not expected this from her. My mother had always been the smoother, the settler, the woman who redirected difficult conversations toward safer ground before they could do any damage. This was not that. This was something else. "I know you did your best with what you had, Mom," I said. And I meant it because I did believe that, imperfectly and incompletely but genuinely. "I could have done better," she said simply. "I should have." We talked for almost an hour that night. About things we hadn't talked about in years, maybe ever. About what it felt like to grow up in that house as the daughter. About the college dinner and the silence that followed it. About the years of distance and what had filled them on both sides. It was not a perfect conversation. It was halting and uneven, and there were long pauses and a few moments where neither of us quite knew what to say. But it was honest. And in my family, honest was revolutionary. Thursday morning I put on the gray blazer I reserved for important meetings, the one I had bought myself the week I made partner at Vantage Capital. I drove to Patricia's office in Center City, found parking 2 blocks away, and walked the rest of the way in the cold November air. My father and Marcus were already in the conference room when I arrived. My father was wearing the Tag Heuer watch. I noticed it immediately, and then I noticed that noticing it didn't make me feel anything particular anymore. It was just a watch. He stood when I walked in. Not to command the room. Just to acknowledge me. I nodded at him and took my seat across the table, and Patricia brought in the documents and we began. Patricia ran the meeting the way she ran everything, methodically and without sentimentality. She walked us through each document in order, pausing at every signature line to confirm understanding before anyone picked up a pen. My father sat across from me with Marcus to his left. My father kept his hands flat on the table in front of him, the way people do when they are trying to project calm they are not entirely feeling. Marcus mostly looked at the documents. Occasionally he looked at me. I looked at Patricia and at the pages in front of me and at my own handwriting on the notes I had brought. We got through the loan restructuring agreement first. Technical, detailed, financially precise. My father signed without hesitation. Marcus signed. I signed. Patricia notarized each page and moved to the next document. The repayment schedule. Same process. The collateral agreement placing the Alderbrook Court property as security against my guarantee. My father's pen paused for just a fraction of a second before he signed that one. I saw it. I didn't comment on it. Then Patricia placed the final document on the table. The acknowledgement. It was 2 pages. The first was the financial language, the material support, the debt obligation, the terms I had outlined to Marcus over the phone. My father read it carefully, more carefully than he had read the other documents, and then he signed it. His handwriting was the same as it had always been, large and decisive, the signature of a man who had spent decades making things official with a single stroke. But his face when he set the pen down was different from any expression I had seen on him before. Not broken. Not ashamed. Just open in a way it had never quite been in my presence. Patricia turned to the second page. This was the paragraph. The one Marcus had warned me my father would never sign. The inequitable distribution of family resources. The formal written acknowledgement that what had been done to me was wrong. My father read it slowly. I watched his jaw move slightly, the way it did when he was processing something he hadn't finished deciding about yet. The room was very quiet. Outside the conference room window I could see the gray Philadelphia skyline, the buildings muted and still in the November light. He picked up the pen. He signed it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Patricia collected the pages efficiently, her professionalism holding the room together in the absence of anything else. Marcus exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath he had clearly been holding for some time. I looked at my father's signature on that second page, the large, decisive handwriting applied to words he could never take back, and I felt something release in my chest. Not dramatically. Not like a dam breaking. More like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long you'd forgotten it was there, finally, quietly loosening. "Thank you," I said. I was looking at my father when I said it. He nodded once. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Sophie. For the record, I know that's not in any of these documents, but I want it said out loud in front of people." He glanced at Patricia briefly, then back at me. "I'm sorry." I had waited 32 years for that sentence. I had imagined it in 100 different versions, in 100 different rooms, with 100 different emotional landscapes around it. The actual version was 3 words delivered in a conference room in Center City, Philadelphia on a cold Thursday afternoon by a tired man in a good watch. It was nothing like what I had imagined. It was better because it was true. "I hear you," I said. That was all. Not "I forgive you," because forgiveness is not a light switch and I had learned not to promise things I wasn't certain I could deliver. But "I hear you. I mean that counts." Marcus drove my father back to Cherry Hill after the meeting. Before he left, he stopped beside me in the hallway outside Patricia's office and he said without preamble, "I'm going to do better, sophomore. With the business. With Dad. With you." He said it quickly, like he was afraid of losing his nerve. "I just wanted you to know." "I know," I said. "I believe you." He nodded and caught up to our father at the elevator, and I stood in the hallway and watched them go. I want to tell you what happened after that, because a story like this one doesn't end in a conference room and it doesn't end with signatures on a page. It ends in the ordinary days that follow, in the slow and uneven process of figuring out what you do with a family once the thing that was broken between you has been, if not repaired exactly, at least honestly named. The Camden projects were successfully restructured. The bank accepted the new terms. Construction resumed on both sites within 6 weeks of the signing, and the first project reached its completion milestone 4 months later. The penalty clauses never triggered. My guarantee was never called. The repayment schedule my father had agreed to began on time and, as of the last payment I received, has continued on time without a single missed installment. Patricia reviewed each transfer and confirmed the amounts. Everything was exactly as agreed. I will give Dennis Halverson this: when he commits to something on paper, he honors it. That was always true of him in business. It turned out to be true here as well. But the more interesting changes were the ones that didn't involve money at all. My mother and I talk on the phone twice a week now. Real conversations, not the careful surface-level exchanges we'd been having for years. She started seeing a therapist in January, someone who specializes in family dynamics, and she brings what she is learning into our conversations in ways that are sometimes clumsy and always genuine. She is doing the work of understanding herself, and I respect that more than I can easily articulate, because I know how hard that work is, and I know she is doing it in her late 60s, which is not when most people choose to start. My father and I have dinner once a month. Just the two of us, which was my suggestion and which surprised him visibly when I made it. We go to a restaurant in Cherry Hill, nothing fancy, a place that does good pasta and has quiet enough tables that you can actually hear each other. We talk about work, his and mine. We talk about the business, how it's recovering, what he is doing differently. Occasionally we talk about the past, carefully, in small doses, the way you might handle something that is still fragile and hasn't fully set yet. He doesn't always say the right thing. Sometimes he retreats into old habits and I can see the armor going back up behind his eyes. But then he catches himself and tries again. And trying, I have decided, counts for something real. Marcus is different too. He hired an outside financial consultant for Halverson Property Group in January, something my father had resisted for years on the grounds that he preferred to keep everything in-house. Marcus pushed for it and my father let him, which felt like its own kind of progress. Marcus also called me last month, not about the business, just to call. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential. Sports, a show we'd both apparently been watching, a memory from childhood that turned out to be funny in retrospect even though it wasn't at the time. It was the most normal conversation I had ever had with my brother. Afterward I sat in my kitchen and realized I had laughed 3 times during it without noticing. I'm not going to tell you that my family is fixed. I don't believe in fixed when it comes to people, and I don't think you should either. What I believe in is movement. The slow, imperfect, frequently frustrating movement toward something better than what you had before. My family is moving in the right direction at an uneven pace, with occasional backsliding and occasional moments of grace. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about where we are. Here is what I know about myself after all of it. I know that the version of me who sat at that dining room table at 18 and folded her acceptance letter back into its envelope did not deserve what happened to her. I know that the years she spent building something alone without a safety net or a cheerleader or a single person in her corner who was supposed to be there, were years that left marks. Some of those marks are still there. Probably they will always be there in some form. That's not a tragedy. That's just the truth of how formative wounds work. They become part of the architecture of who you are. But I also know this. I am sitting in a condo I bought myself in a city I chose on a career I built from nothing with a life that belongs entirely to me. I did not find a husband to provide my future. I provided it myself. And when the people who told me that wasn't possible needed saving, it was my signature, my credit, my carefully built financial life that was the only thing standing between them and collapse. There is something clarifying about that. Not cruel, not triumphant, just clarifying. Like a lens finally brought into focus after years of blurriness. I always knew my own worth. On the hard days I just needed to remind myself to keep knowing it. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of this story, the girl who got the lesser share, the one who was told her ambitions were inconvenient, the one who built everything alone while watching someone else get handed what should have been available to everyone, I want you to hear this clearly. The story is not over when they stop believing in you. The story is just beginning. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over your life after a long fight finally ends. Not the quiet of emptiness, not the quiet of loss, but the quiet of a room after everyone has gone home and the furniture is still warm and the glasses are still on the table and you are standing in the middle of it all trying to figure out what you do now that the thing you spent years bracing for has come and gone. That was the quiet I lived inside for the first few weeks after the signing. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. I answered emails. And underneath all of it, running like a low current through every ordinary moment, was this unfamiliar sensation I kept having to identify from scratch each time it surfaced. It took me almost 2 weeks to name it accurately. The word was peace. I had not felt that particular thing in a very long time. Possibly I had never felt it, not as an adult, not in connection to my family. There had always been something unresolved sitting at the edge of everything, some open loop that hummed quietly in the background of whatever else I was doing. The loop was closed now. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. Enough that the background noise had finally gone still. I want to tell you about something that happened about 6 weeks after the signing because it changed the shape of what I understood about all of it. I was at work in the middle of a portfolio review when my assistant knocked and said I had a visitor in the lobby. No appointment, no advance notice, just someone who had shown up and given their name and asked if I had a few minutes. The name she gave me was Dennis Halverson. I told her to give me 5 minutes and then send him up. He had never been to my office before. In 8 years at Vantage Capital, in a firm whose name he had heard referenced in conversation, my father had never once asked where I worked, what the building looked like, what floor I was on, what my office faced. He walked in that afternoon in his coat with the collar still up from the cold outside, and he stood in the doorway of my office and looked around at it the way people look at a place they suddenly realize they should have seen a long time ago. The framed degrees on the wall. The view of Market Street through the window. The nameplate on my desk that said Senior Portfolio Manager. He looked at all of it for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I should have come here years ago." I gestured at the chair across from my desk and he sat down and unbuttoned his coat and we looked at each other across the width of my desk, the same width that had been between us for most of my life, and for once neither of us tried to fill the space with something that wasn't real. He had brought something with him. A manila envelope, the kind with the metal clasp, the kind people use when they want to convey that whatever is inside matters. He set it on my desk and slid it toward me without explanation. I opened it. Inside was a single document, 2 pages, printed on plain paper with his signature already at the bottom. I read it slowly. It was a revised will amendment. He had added my name as an equal beneficiary alongside Marcus in Halverson Property Group. Not a token inclusion, not a symbolic gesture padded with caveats. An equal share. 50%. The same as Marcus. He had signed it the previous week and had it notarized and had driven it to my office in person rather than mailing it because, as he said when I looked up from the pages, he wanted to hand it to me himself. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect tears in a moment like that and I did not have them, not right then. What I had was something quieter and more internal, a kind of settling, the way a building settles into its foundation after years of minor shifts and micro-adjustments. Something that had been slightly off for a very long time had just found its level. You didn't have to do this, I said. I know, he said. That's why I did it. We talked for an hour that afternoon. Not about the business, not about the documents, not about the past in any direct way. We talked about my work, what I actually did day to day, what I found satisfying about it, what I found hard. He asked real questions and listened to the answers and occasionally pushed back in the way that people who understand business push back. Not to contradict but to understand more precisely. And I realized sitting there that my father and I, had things been different, had he made different choices 30 years ago, might have had hundreds of conversations like this one. The thought was not entirely sad. It was also something else. A glimpse of what was still possible even now, even here, even this late. When he stood to leave he paused at the door and looked back at me and said, "Your mother wants to know if you'd come for Christmas this year. To the house." He said it carefully, like he was aware of the weight it carried and wanted to carry it properly. No pressure. No expectations. Just dinner. I thought about the Alderbrook courthouse. The brick front and the black shutters and the wreath my mother changed with the seasons. The dining room table where so much of my story had been written in silence. I thought about sitting at that table again as myself, fully, without shrinking, without the old familiar urge to disappear. Yes, I said. I'll come. He nodded and left and I stood at my office window and watched Market Street below and thought about how the same place can mean entirely different things depending on who you are when you return to it. Christmas at Alderbrook Court was not a movie. I want to be clear about that. It was not a perfectly orchestrated reconciliation with a string score underneath it and everyone saying exactly the right things in exactly the right order. My father made a comment over dinner that landed slightly wrong and then caught himself and corrected it. Marcus and I had one moment of old friction that surfaced briefly over something minor and then dissolved just as quickly. My mother over-explained things she was nervous about and under-explained things she should have said more clearly. It was a real family dinner with real people who were still figuring out the new architecture of how they fit together. But there was also this. After dinner, when my mother was in the kitchen and Marcus was watching something in the other room, my father and I sat at the dining room table with our coffee, just the two of us, in the same chairs we had sat in 30 years ago when the world was arranged very differently. And he said without prompting, without occasion, simply because it was true and he wanted to say it, "I'm proud of you, Sophie." I should have been saying that for years. I'm saying it now. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and looked at my father across the dining room table that had held so much silence between us and I said, "Thank you, Dad. That means something to me." And I meant it completely. That is not everything. I know that. A sentence over coffee does not rewrite 30 years and I am not asking it to. But it is something real, spoken out loud in the room where it needed to be said. And sometimes that is exactly enough. I drove back to Philadelphia that evening in the dark with the heater running and the radio low and the highway mostly empty and I thought about the 18-year-old who had sat in a parking lot alone after her graduation and cried for 10 minutes before wiping her face and driving to return her library books because life kept moving and you had to move with it. I thought about what I would tell her if I could. I thought about it for a long time. Here is what I would say. I would say that the years you are about to spend building something alone will be the hardest years of your life and also the most important. I would say that the loneliness of doing things without the people who were supposed to support you is real and it is allowed to hurt and you don't have to pretend it doesn't. I would say that the strength you develop in the absence of a safety net is a different kind of strength from any other kind, particular and deep and entirely your own. I would say that the people who dismissed you are not the authors of your story. You are. And I would say this. Hold your conditions. Know your worth before anyone else does. Build the thing they said you couldn't build. And when the day comes that they need what only you can give, because that day will come, meet it with your eyes open and your terms clear and your signature on your own terms. Not because it's revenge. Because it's the truth of who you became despite everything they withheld. The life I have now is mine in a way that nothing handed to me could ever have been. Every part of it was earned, chosen, constructed deliberately from the materials I had available, which were never abundant and were sometimes nearly nothing. I would not trade that for an easier road. Not because hardship is romantic, it isn't, but because the person I am on the other side of it is someone I genuinely respect. And I spent too many years waiting for someone else to offer me that respect to give it up now. So that is the story. All of it as honestly as I know how to tell it. If it found you at the right time, I hope it stays with you. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, pass it along. Some stories are meant to travel. Take care of yourselves, every single one of you. You have all absolutely earned it. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.